All right, so types of flood damage, flood history, and future forecasts. So there's two primary types of flood damage that we typically talk about. Inundation, yeah, I'm gonna have to sit here. It's gonna be hard for you to do it, Jen, because, so inundation, the river comes up, buildings get saturated, basements fill with sediment. It's a mess. It's very traumatic, very damaging, and expensive for those that experience it, right? It's serious damage. The other type of damage is erosion damage, right? The river banks erode, the bed erodes, the river maybe moves in its entirety and takes out anything in its path, right? So inundation damage versus erosion damage. One important thing to keep in mind is that by far the more expensive damage to recover from is the erosion damage. That's where probably 90%, well, I shouldn't even throw out percentages because I don't remember that number off my top of my head, but it's where the vast majority of the recovery dollars are spent, dealing with erosion damage, okay? Roads, bridges, structures fall into the river, that sort of thing. Okay, so moving into a little history of Vermont's floods. National Weather Service had their list of top 5 in 23. Week 23 flood got added to that, going back to 1869 and spanning through 2023. Large-scale regional or large-scale, nearly statewide floods, very expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars. Those are all, those dollars are all adjusted for 2012 dollars. So very expensive. Point being that the flood history in Vermont is very long, right? Flooding is not anything new, right? And damaging floods, expensive floods are not anything new. If we look more recently, going back to 73, DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation Rivers Program, compiled information on smaller scale flood events, as well as the bigger ones. So we see between 1973 and 2023, there were 4 large scale disastrous floods. 3 of those are on that National Weather Service list that I just showed. The other one is 1976, which being, despite the fact that it was regional and very damaging in Huntington, statewide didn't make the top 5 most expensive or the top 6 most expensive floods. And then looking at smaller regional scale floods, and these are all floods for which disaster declarations were made. Regional scale floods, between 73 and 2011, 19 of those smaller scale floods, which works out to about 1 flood every 2 years on the regional scale. So again, flooding, we have a long history. We have very frequent occurrences of floods in Vermont. The FEMA flood study lists the floods in Huntington, severe floods 1830, 1858, 1927, 36, 38, 71, which isn't one that I'm familiar with, 73 and 76. And it notes that the 76 flood caused by Hurricane Bell resulted in much road and bridge and personal property damage. And I've heard that from folks in town, that was a severely or significantly devastating flood in Huntington. So yeah, just a little more on flood history. And what we know from forecasting of precipitation trends, climate change, it's only going to get worse. This graphic shows that since 1958, the amount of precipitation falling as very wet or very heavy, intense events has increased by 74%. So our storms are getting more intense, more rainfall is falling in those intense storms, and that's only going to increase. Here's a study in Science News that states that the extreme precipitation in northeast U.S. to increase by 52% by the end of the century. So it's only going to get worse. We're going to get more intense storms, more events where large volumes of water are coming down the river. The Gund Institute at UVM has a study out there showing that property damage are expected to exceed $5.2 billion over the next 100 years. Right? So there's going to be a lot more damage. I was looking around today and I was seeing stuff from Europe that was essentially saying the same stuff. The UK and France saying the same thing, right? So yeah, these really large 100-year floods and greater are happening much more frequently than we would think when, by the name 100-year flood, right? Like, yeah, they're occurring a lot more frequently than once every 100 years. And we can talk about the why. Well, it's because of what we're seeing with climate change for the most part. So now let's just shift gears a little bit and talk about river dynamics and river morphology and this concept of balance or equilibrium in our river systems. So we talk about, if we're going to talk about how rivers move and erode and fill in, we're talking really about the shape or the form or the morphology of the river. So the morphology of the river, you know, we talk about the shape of the cross-section, the shape of the meanders as the stream moves down the valley. We talk about the slope of the channel or the profile, and we talk about bed form. So we're just really describing the shape of the river. So one thing to note is that the shape or the morphology of the river, whether it's really meandering or straight, really narrow with ripples and dunes versus broader, wider with steps and pools, that morphology is, as described by the cross-section, slope and bed form and plain form, is a reflection of the valley type, right? So, you know, we all know if we go up into Brush Brook and it's going to get steep and narrow, and the river's going to be straight and steps, and it's going to have steps and pools. And then down here in the broader valley, the Huntington main stem valley, the river meanders a bit more and it has more like riffle pool, bed form. So the river is the reflection of the valley morphology. And the way the river behaves or moves over time is a reflection of the inputs to the river from that valley or the watershed, right? So we have sediment inputs, we have rain inputs, we have wood inputs as trees get recruited into the river. So these inputs are going to, as they change, the river will change in response. And I'm talking like, you know, long-term sort of trends, like change over 20, 50, 100 years. As the climate changes, the river's going to change. As we remove, as we expose soils, the sediment regime is going to change. The delivery of sediment to the river is going to change, and the river's going to respond to that.
And that last graphic
Yeah.
showed the Huntington is that bottom form, but I'm pretty sure there's no part of the Huntington River that's less than 0.1% gradient. Ours is 1%.
0.1%.
Right, 0.1, but the bottom one is 0.1% max.
Yeah.
Which would mean most of the Huntington would be in the next level above that.
Yeah, this one right here. This one right here. Yeah. So meanders and riffles and pools. Yeah. Probably no places in the Huntingtons where you have dune ripple bed forms or that severe meander. Yeah, that you don't have an E-type shape. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So yeah, this one here. All right. So what, how do we think about the river and its movements over time as it responds to these different input changes? There's a hydraulics engineer back in, I think it was like the 50s, by the name of Emery Lane, came up with the idea of describing this all in terms of a balance, and in terms of balance, and it works pretty well. So here's how this works, right? Rivers, there's this flux or this balance, this constant dance between the power of the water in the river system and the resistance of that river channel to that power. Okay, so if you have equilibrium, if you have balance, the river maintains its morphology, its depth, its width. It doesn't fill in and it doesn't erode and get larger, right? And that's what we're managing for. That's what we're trying to manage for. That's what the policy of the state of Vermont managed for. So if you look at river management policy, the word equilibrium is there a lot. That's because this is the most stable condition that we can achieve, right? This equilibrium. It's all about river stability. We don't want our rivers, we want to minimize the amount to which rivers are moving around side to side, right? And damaging human investments. So we're managing for equilibrium. If there's too much resistance, which is partly made up by the amount of material in the channel, it overpowers the flow power and the channel fills in, right? Pretty simple. Okay, conceptually, pretty simple. If the power of the flow over time gets greater than the resistance is able to resist, you get excessive erosion, right? You get the channel down cutting, deepening, and you get the channel widening, okay? So let's look a little bit more in more detail at these factors at play here in this balance. So on the power side, power is made up by slope of the channel and depth of the water. And of course, depth of the water has a lot to do with how much water is actually in the channel volume, right? When we have a high flow event, the water's deep. When we have a low flow event, the water's shallow, okay? But depth and slope really are the influencers on stream power. So depth plays a role in power because if you think about it, every cubic foot of water weighs 62.4 pounds. So as you get 1 foot stacked on another foot, stacked on another foot, you're adding 62 pounds to that square foot of surface area of the bed, and those gravels and cobbles that make up that bed. And as that water slides across the bed or flows across the bed, it's dragging that material. So the more depth, the more weight you have bearing down, the more material gets moved. That's power doing work on the channel, right? So depth equals power, okay? So this is where the idea of the floodplain, or the floodplain, becomes really important in moderating the depth or governing the depth of flow in the channel. When you have a channel that's well connected to its floodplain, and what I mean by that is that the banks of the channel are pretty low, you have a high flow come through, and that flow gets to the top of the bank, but then it gets out onto the floodplain. And it can't continue to build up deeper and deeper because it's being absorbed by the width of the floodplain, right? It's going to fill that entire floodplain. So the rate of increase in depth, as soon as you get over the top of the bank, really drops off. And depth is governed and power is governed, right? The floodplain is the energy dissipation. It's the blow-off valve for the river system, right? The water gets up there, it spreads out. There's roughness elements, whether it's corn stalks or trees or whatever it is, grass. It all works to slow the water down over this really broad area. You're spreading out that energy across a much broader area, therefore really reducing the amount of work that's done in any one spot. On the contrary, when we have rivers that are what we refer to as incised, i.e. their banks are really tall, and that same flood event or that same flow event comes through, it doesn't get out onto the floodplain because that channel is so big it contains all of the flow. Now you have that really deep flow, right? 62 pounds, 124.8, 187, pounds bearing down on every square foot of the bed, dragging and scraping that material, eroding that channel. You have a lot of power, a lot of work being done. So that's the importance of the floodplain connection and having lower banks. And that's the problem with channel incision. Everybody good so far? So this is why a lot of people will say, if you have structures getting wet and you resort to dredging the channel next to that structure, what you're doing is taking that pressure relief valve away from that channel, putting all of that power onto the bed, and you get downward erosion, you get toe erosion, and all of a sudden your flooding problem turns into an erosion problem. And the erosion problem is much more expensive to deal with. All right, so still talking about the terms involved in stream power. The other one is slope. Right, I said slope and depth are the two factors in generating power. Slope is a factor simply because the steeper you are, the more normal you are to the pull of gravity, so the water is influenced more strongly, right? So really the way that humans have affected the slope of rivers for the most part is to straighten them, right? If you have a river that starts at point A, or a reach of river from point A to point B, and let's say the elevation is 875 down to 850, this meandering river is much longer, right? It's more horizontal distance, so it's flatter than the straight channel, which is shorter. You get a higher slope, okay? So this is why, when we straighten rivers, and we've done a lot of this historically in Vermont, I don't think we straighten rivers as dramatically as we used to, but we used to. And we really increased the amount of energy power and triggered a lot of river instability that way, okay? So now we covered power, now let's look at the resistance side. In the resistance, we basically have roughness of the channel, and then the amount of sediment to dissipate or to absorb the energy, suck up the energy of the flow. So on the resistance of the channel, we have things like bed forms, right? These steps and pools. They cause the water to turn and tumble. You get white water. White water is simply the burn expenditure of energy. So those roughness elements sap the flow of its energy. Meanders. Whenever the water has to go around a meander bend, it gets put into this helical flow pattern, and it scours the bed and it drops the deposits on the point bars. All of that turning and erosion of the bottom, that all saps the river of its energy. Meanders are great energy dissipators or forms of resistance to the power of the channel. Gravel bars themselves are resistance because the river has to pick that up. Anytime the river has gravel that it picks up and carries, it's burning energy picking up that gravel instead of burning energy eroding a bank somewhere else. So the gravel that's in the channel is a source of roughness or resistance that's going to sap the river of its energy. Large wood is a form of roughness. I know large wood can create a lot of problems for our infrastructure, but let's put that aside for a second and just recognize that it is a form of roughness. It traps a lot of sediment that otherwise would make it downstream, and it slows water, okay? So it burns energy in the river channel. It's just another roughness element. So that's it on the concept of equilibrium. You have power on one side, you have resistance on the other side. We're trying to manage for equilibrium so that we have rivers that are as least erosive as possible.
Shayne, maybe you'll go into it later, but the impact of armoring banks, will you be discussing?
We can talk about that later, yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to jump. I can't, is that clock's not right? I know we had a little mishap here, but I didn't think it took that much time.
7:05.
So I'm done.
Well, you can have 5 more minutes.
Okay. All right. All right, so just want to talk about the long history of channel management. And this isn't just Vermont, it's just not North America, it's global, right? It's global. So what we do as humans, it's intuitive to us to try to control these systems so that we can use the surrounding landscapes for different land uses. But point is that, you know, when the fur trappers came through, kind of before European settlement, I guess technically that's before settlement, the fur trappers came through, they eradicated or they took out all the beaver, right? So then all those beaver dams failed. Some estimates have beaver dams at 1 dam every 100 yards along a stream before that happened. So just think of all those roughness elements in the river clogging up the rivers, right? So that dramatically changed our river systems, the hydrologic cycle. Splash dams, there was a lot of snagging to clear the streams for transport of logs during the logging era, right? So that's all really well documented in books like Tall Trees and Tough Men by John Pike. We use dynamite to straighten cookage streams, steam shovels. More recently, we get in the diesel era, right? Straighten, dredge, armor, berm, right? So we have a long history of managing channels. And we've straightened the rivers as part of this. I'm confused between my tools here. So rivers naturally want to meander. Fluid flowing through a medium is going to meander. The jet stream flowing across the atmosphere, it meanders, right? It's just the rules, the rules of physics will cause a fluid flowing through a medium to meander, okay? That's just physics at work. Whether it's the third branch of the White River in Lower Granville along Route 100, or here in Huntington, up in the center, Black Creek in Fairfield, or even large rivers like the Winooski to accommodate I-89, we've done a lot of channel straightening throughout Vermont, and again, throughout North America and around the world. So what's the response been? The response is well described by this channel evolution model. This is one of several channel evolution models. It's just a way to describe graphically what goes on. But basically, you start pre-disturbance, the channel well connected to its floodplain. It can dissipate all the energy of floods. Structure goes in, the structure gets wet a few times. We build the berms to protect the structure that disconnects the river from the channel. Now we're in this incision stage. We have all that power now working on the bed, the channel incisors until the banks get so high that they start to fall in. We get into this widening phase. The investments come into the river. Then there's so much gravel that comes into the river starts to degrade, starts to fill in, the power starts to reduce. We come back into balance as all that sediment comes in and saps the river of its energy. And then we get back to a stable condition where you have, once again, a river well connected to a broad floodplain, all set within this previous valley. Through all that, we've lost a lot of land mass and we've lost a lot of investments. Here are just some images, and I'm going to go pretty quickly since I'm so far behind, but that's the stable stage, stage 1. Here's stage 2, an example of stage 2, that's an incising channel. That's the widening phase, and that's the west branch of the Little River and Stowe. That's the aggrading stage or restabilizing stage, and then that's stage 5, where you've got the original floodplain up here high, then you've got this lower floodplain that's more recently developed in the channel. So that's the full evolution process. Let's see. So the Department of Environmental Conservation worked with consultants such as Arrowwood Environmental to assess 5,000 miles of river, and this is in the field taking measurements using survey equipment and measuring equipment, and found that 75% of those 5,000 miles are in stages 2 through 4 of the channel evolution process. They're disconnected from their floodplain, they're very unstable, and they're just ripe to explode during the next flood event. Right? They don't have that pressure relief valve in the floodplain anymore. So I don't know if we can extrapolate that out. I think there's 23,000 miles total in the state. If you can extrapolate that 75%, does that mean 75% of all the river miles, all those 23,000 miles are incised or disconnected from their floodplains? Maybe. I don't know for sure. That study wasn't designed scientifically to be able to do that, but maybe. So point is that there's a lot of unstable rivers across the state. And we find ourselves, and this is the last slide, we find ourselves sort of in the cycle where we encroach upon the river channels with structures. The floods come through, create a lot of damage. We respond with dredging, armoring, and berming, and 10, 15 years go by, we start to feel safe again, and we further encroach upon the river channel, and then the next flood comes across, and we have even more expensive damage next time. So this is just like this escalating cycle of cost and risk and ecosystem damage that we've kind of been in for many, many, many years, decades. And with that, I'll stop talking and let the next presenter come up.
I'll just introduce myself now. So I'm Eldridge, Aquatic Habitat Biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. My main focus is on fish and aquatic organisms, but fish live in the same rivers that you all enjoy. And so dealing with fish means dealing with people. And making the world, or making these rivers better for fish, what we're hoping to do is actually make them better for everybody, for the people living on the rivers, the people enjoying them as well. I also want to start by saying that I have no idea what you all have been through. I understand it's intense. Like, I cannot relate to what you've done, what you've had to go through. And I'm not here to try and dictate or prescribe anything. But what I do want to present is kind of the background why we have the regulations in Vermont that we do. So understand that, human health and safety takes precedence. I understand that, we respect that, but we also regulate it because as Shayne pointed out, we understand that our history of channel management actually has maybe made things worse in some cases. So what we're trying to do is find a balance, really, between balancing human health and safety with the other issues that rivers deal with, other processes, and the other benefits that rivers can provide. And so, and I think the other main point being that the approach that we take in Vermont is based on really decades or even centuries of experience of trying to deal with channel river management. And so this is basically what we've come up with as the best way to kind of balance that human health and safety versus the natural processes. All right, so I'll just give you a little background, talk about some of the habitat features, and then if I have time, I'll talk about culverts for fun.
We'll the mic a little closer.
Okay, so as Shayne already mentioned, so there's the different types of flooding. So inundation flooding is one of the when we think about flooding, generally it's inundation, right? So when the river comes up, it spills out onto the floodplain. This is actually a property not here. This is over in Morrisville, and ironically, this property is flooded at least 8 times in the last 40 years, above the 100-year flood event level. So, you know, as Shayne was saying, we're seeing these more extreme events happening in Vermont. Some of you may recognize this. This is an example of that, the erosion. So this is not spilling out onto the floodplain. This is the river meandering and undercutting. This is the hotel up in Hardwick. These are all from 2023, by the way. There's another type of damage that I think about, and that's when channels start to move material, particularly wood and rocks, right? And that's another thing that rivers can do. This becomes an issue when we have undersized structures, culverts and bridges, and that material gets clogged there and can cause damage. This is actually, ironically, this is Plainfield 2023, and this same area just got devastated this year, and unfortunately it was much worse. And then just again, the undersized infrastructure, we're seeing it getting overpowered by these floods and just wiping out our roads. And so this is when we begin to see impacts to people from the floods. A lot of us experience it, you know, in this event when the roads are closed for a long time. And so how have we dealt with it in the past? And you know, this is not that long ago. This is actually last year. We basically put the culvert back, the same exact culvert that we had, put it right back, and just pave over it. And you know, that's honestly what they do in 49 other states. Is they just put the same structure back. Vermont is fortunate in that we're able to put back structures that are bigger after a flood, but historically this is what we've done. And then as Shayne said, the other thing we've done is we've gone into rivers with heavy equipment and we've pulled out trees and boulders and things, and we've tried to remove that material that we think is a threat to us. Here's another example. This is from Irene. But as a result, what we end up is systems like this. This is kind of what people think is ideal. And this is, again, after Irene, what some of the rivers in Vermont looks like. This is Gilead Brook over in Bethel. And so it's pretty obvious in here, they took a bulldozer and they basically just pushed all the material out of the channel, out of the river, and they actually put it up on the banks. And the intention here is to get the water out of that system as quickly as possible. Right? They don't want any of that flooding. They don't want any of that erosion that we were talking about. The goal is to get the stream out of there. From a fish standpoint, this is a desert. You will not see a fish in a system like that. And the other, so what we've seen after floods, this is the Fish and Wildlife Department going out and monitoring streams and rivers after floods. So where we've got rivers that look like this, we see a large decline in the fish population, and basically it just doesn't recover. So there's some systems where, you know, after Irene, we haven't seen the fish population recover. We're actually going back in and trying to restore that structure. Again, where it's safe to do so, where we don't think there's a risk to human health and safety. The alternative is where rivers aren't managed at all, where we basically are leaving the wood in place. We're seeing the fish populations, a small decline immediately after the flood, but actually a recovery within 1 to 3 years. The populations bounce back. even, and it was ironic, but actually from some of the anglers, we're actually hearing reports like last fall was some of the best fishing they've ever seen. And that's because we got, actually these floods can be stimulating to fish populations. You see a lot more material coming in, you get insects and things coming in, and the fish that are able to survive are actually, there's like a little boost in their production. And so that can help with the recovery. Another issue is, Shayne hit on, we've been managing these channels for probably over 100 years, and we developed our houses and our road and our infrastructures in a system that did not have rivers, or wood or trees. Also, these channels were straightened. And so often we'll see communities that look like this, where you have a historical channel that's been straightened, all the material's been removed from it, and then houses have been put on top. Now, going back to what Shayne was talking about, rivers like to meander, they like to move material. Now we've created a conflict where the river is not able to do its natural processes anymore. We've created a flood risk here, right? By putting these properties in that way of where the river wants to go. And this, unfortunately, is what we've seen in a lot of areas in Vermont. And the other thing that this has done is it's turned these channels into pipes. So all that water going downstream, what it ends up doing is it creates bigger problems for the people living downstream. So, he's talking about the weight of water. Basically, one way to think of it is dump trucks, loaded dump trucks full of water, basically banging into the riverbank at sometimes like 30 or 40 miles an hour for hours on end. That is what's happening during these floods. It's massive, massive amounts of power. And the damage that we've seen, at least in last year and this year, is just a testament to what that water can do. And so what happens when we turn these rivers into pipes. All right, and so our regulations basically speak to how can we live with flooding. Recognizing that it's going to occur, it's a natural process, it may be getting worse. So what are the things that we can do to try and live with it? And so I'm going to be talking about the stuff we can do in the riparian area, or that floodplain zone, the in-streams, and then culverts. And so riparian, so this is that floodplain area. So again, what can we do to help with that inundation and erosion risks? So historically what we've done is we've tried to burn, and historically, again, this is 2023, so what we've done is we've tried to keep the river off of our property. We've channelized the stream and we've burned it. And as Shayne said, the risk, though, is that now we've created a steeper, more powerful stream, which can increase the amount of damage that we had. And so that meandering channel, as Shayne said, that can be more stable. I want to emphasize that stable does not mean static. It doesn't mean it doesn't move around. We will see erosion. You will see the channel meander over time, but basically it'll meander within that river, what we call the river corridor. And the idea is you'll have less damage to other properties. It'll also reduce the amount of water and power downstream. And so this actually, a lot of people look at a picture like this and they're like, oh no, that's flooding, that's a bad thing. But there's no structures here, there's no development, there's no infrastructure. To me, this is actually a floodplain functioning as it should. So what I'd like to encourage people is to actually see this as the desired condition. So what happens is now that we have water being stored on this floodplain, that's an area for it to spread out, slow down, and less water going downstream. And we've seen a good example of this over in Otter Creek. Otter Creek, the channels, Rutland is downstream of Menden Brook, pretty steep. Doesn't have much of a floodplain. And so there's these two graphs here. Let me give a pointer out. These two graphs show that flood water coming through. This is during a tropical storm Irene. And so what we see in Rutland is the water's coming down. Here's August 11th, 18th, 21st. And then here's Tropical Storm Irene. All that water basically hits Rutland all at the same time, right? So that's this massive wall of water coming down to Rutland. There's not anywhere for it to slow down or spread out. That same water, by the time it got to Middlebury, was able to spread out in these kind of wetland areas, this kind of floodplain. And so same amount of water, right? Same river, same amount of water. But because it was able to spread out, it didn't get as high, it didn't get as intense. And so Middlebury didn't have the same amount of damage. And so these wetlands were credited with basically saving those communities, so Brandon, Cornwall, and Middlebury. And so what we're doing in Vermont is where it's safe, again, where it's safe to do so, where we can, is we're trying to restore these floodplains and including doing a lot of tree planting. And so now I'm going to talk about the importance of trees to fish. Again, because there's a lot of conflict between tree management and river resources. And so we like to say fish grow on trees, and you can actually make a literal connection between trees and fish. So let's see, the fish eat the insects that eat the leaves that come from the trees. So you really can make a literal connection between the fish and the tree. The fish is derived from the tree nutrients. But there's other things that we see too. So the bucket of benefits, I like to say. But anyway, so the temperature moderation. So just, these are two different streams we both like Granville for some reason. Anyway, so this is the White River. So this is a channel that's not shaded. It's pretty open. This is on the first branch of the White River. And it gets up to about 70 or 80 degrees in the summertime, versus an Alder Meadow Brook, which is pretty shaded, doesn't get above 70. And so what we see for brook trout is they won't survive in streams that get above 70, 72 degrees. So we don't see any brook trout in a stream like this. But in these shaded rivers and streams, they're able to stay cool enough to sustain our cold water fish. And again, that's because of the shading from the trees along the stream channel. And this is important because in Vermont, we're actually seeing a rise in our air temperatures. And so this is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Vermont's temperature going back to 1895. And basically this line right here is the mean temperature from during the 20th century, from 1901 to 2000. And what we see, this blue line is the trend between 1999 and 2021. And what we see, two things to take away. In the last 2 decades, the mean temperature is much warmer than it was historically, and it's continuing to increase, right? So we're seeing this rising temperature is now we're seeing this new threat to our aquatic resources. So again, another important reason to try and keep our streams cool. And then again, the fish eat the leaves, and the bugs. It's not just important for fish, but there's a lot of other animals that use the riparian area, including beavers and wood turtles and bats and bald eagles. And then they're also important travel corridors for a bunch of other animals, including moose, bear, and deer. And then there's the huge water quality benefits. So it's not just habitat issues, but water quality. You can get water quality funding for tree planting. And so here's just a nitrate removal with the width of the riparian buffer, the forested riparian buffer, and this sediment removal. And sediment's important because that's a lot of our phosphorus is tied to sediment. So basically, the wider the buffer, the bigger water quality benefits that we're seeing. And so from a management zone perspective, what we recommend is 100 feet on each side of a river. The other thing I'll point out is that smaller streams are more connected to the surrounding landscape. So there's actually a bigger benefit of maintaining a riparian zone on those small streams. All right, and then in-stream channel management. So again, historically what we've done, dredged and straightened, we removed the trees. We've also tried to engineer these stream channels, try and make the river do kind of what we want. And what we found is that these managed areas from a fish standpoint, this is after Tropical Storm Irene, we went in and looked at channels that were left unaltered and ones that were altered, and the trout populations were vastly reduced in those areas that were altered. So basically where we created these fish deserts where the fish just weren't, were no longer able to survive. Another issue with this dredging, this issue that I want to talk about is, although the dredging occurs at one site, you're creating, by removing that stream bed there, by lowering the stream bed there, you're creating a domino effect, because that bed is going to eventually fill in. And what it's going to do is fill in with the material that's just upstream from it. And that's going to fill in with material upstream. And you end up with what's called a head cut, right? And so you're basically lowering the bed, and that lowering is going to extend all the way upstream, right? And so what we're seeing is that by doing that, you're destabilizing the toe of the slope, right? So Shayne talked about channel evolution, channel widening. And so what we're seeing is these massive slope failures are occurring not because of the power of the channel, the flood, or or any dredging happening near there, but what happened was dredging downstream has destabilized the stream all the way up here, has lowered the channel up to this point, and caused that bank, the toe of the bank, this part, to become unstable, which has caused the entire bank to fail. And so dredging can actually make things worse, because now you've got all these trees falling in, right? And so basically you've created this cycle where you're going to have to continue dredging to remove these trees, but then removing those trees is going to cause this bank to continue to fail.
I have a quick question
Yeah.
with that, maybe you don't know.
Sure.
The difference of that happening because of the river versus maybe an inundation of a lot of water and the erosion from the steepness of the
Yeah.
bank, can you tell the difference?
Can I tell the difference? Not
Can a
necessarily.
scientist?
Oh, sorry. The question was, can we tell whether, what's causing erosion like this, these mass bank failures? When is it caused by either storm runoff or some kind of water from up here versus destabilizing the toe? And I think, there's definitely examples of both, and I personally don't know the answer to that. But I think for the point of this talk, I think it's important to acknowledge that destabilizing the toe is a way that can happen. So it's just something to be aware of. All right, and then just to go back to the benefits of the wood in streams, so these log jams. So what we're finding is that these log jams are basically where the fish are able to survive a flood. So like I said, fish are able to survive these floods, and it's because they have refuge behind these log jams. Because they don't move, they're big enough that they're stable. And the fish basically just hunker down, ride it out, and as soon as the flood's over, they start eating again. And the other benefit of these log jams is the floodwater actually backs up and will spill out onto the floodplain. So we're seeing sediment like this. So again, sediment's where we're seeing our phosphorus. Phosphorus is a nutrient that's a pollutant, or there's too much of it in the Champlain Basin, so we're trying to reduce the amount going in. And so if we can get that phosphorus depositing on our floodplains, that's actually helping our water quality. And so these log jams are actually helping to store those nutrients up here, up in areas where it's safe to do so. And then I will also say that Fish and Wildlife Department thinks that these trees are so important that we're actually going back and putting trees back into channels where it's safe to do so. And so we've created this handbook on how to do it. And what we've seen is that where we've done these engineered log jams, we've actually seen a 300% increase in the biomass of brook trout. So again, a really important function. The other thing, and I'll talk about this in a second, but what we're not seeing is a lot these some of these culverts. Actually, let me talk about this one next. All right, culverts. So again, historically, culverts were designed to pass water. They're designed hydraulically. They weren't designed to pass rocks and trees, right? So, but what we know is that rocks and trees are an important part of what's transported during floods. And so now our standards for sizing stream crossing structures, bridges, and culverts calls for this 1 times bankful width size. I won't go into what 1 time bankful width means, but just understand that it's bigger than what we've got. For the most part. And we've actually gone out and looked at a bunch of these structures. We've assessed them all across or not all of them, but a lot of them. So we've actually looked at a lot of culverts across the state. And anyway, a lot of them are fish barriers. But from a bankful width standpoint, most of them, more than 50%, pushing 70% of them, are less than half of that bankful width, that channel width. So they're a lot smaller than what we think they should be, what our current standard is. And so, but we looked at new ones, and a lot of them look like this. So these are ones that have been replaced by municipalities. And what we did after the July flood, we actually went out and looked at about 60 culverts that were replaced to that 1 times bankful width standard in areas that had been impacted by flooding. And what we found is examples like this. So here's a trip to the jail branch over in Orange, and we had a replaced culvert here and an old culvert there, and this is what the replaced culvert looked like after the flood. Basically, you couldn't even see that it had been involved in a flood. And this is just downstream. The culvert had blown out. So this is a sign that the standards that we have in place are helping with our flood resiliency. They're also helping with fish passage, but that's, anyway, that's another story. But just to understand that what we're doing to help fish is also helping people, all right? Yes, and there's trade-offs to doing it. Again, we recognize that there are going to be situations where we do need to do channel management, but that channel management is not benign. It could have impacts upstream, downstream to your neighbors and to the other aquatic resources. Thanks.
All right, so I am, my name's Worthley, longtime Huntington resident, know most of you I think probably, and I'm also an ecologist and GIS analyst with Arrowwood Environmental, and we're a very small environmental consulting company here in Huntington, and we also have 2 partners who live elsewhere in the state. And we do a variety of work kind of ecologically related with wetlands and wildlife habitat, and helping towns learn about their important resources and identifying things that might have implications for environmental permitting and all these sorts of things. But one of the pieces of work that we have done historically is some of this river assessment work that Shayne mentioned. Of those 5,000 miles of stream that were assessed in Vermont, we did a few of them. So I'm going to talk about, some of that work we did was right here in Huntington, so I want to talk a little bit about kind of the big picture findings of what we came up with out of that work. And then I just want to talk a little bit about kind of a local boy perspective, I guess, and just some of the things that I've observed over the years, a little bit less scientific, a little bit more anecdotal, and I'm going to probably whip through things pretty quickly. But so I'll jump right into the stream geomorphic assessment piece. So this work was done on the Huntington River watershed in from kind of a range of years between 2004 and 2009. This was projects that we started, Arrowwood Environmental started teaming up with some aquatic biologists at the National Wildlife Federation. The Huntington Conservation Commission was sort of our sponsoring organization. Funding came from the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources River Management Program, and then later CCRPC was involved with putting together some of these projects as well. There's kind of multi-stages or phases of these stream geomorphic assessments. Phase 1 is really kind of the starting place, and that's taking a really broad scale look at the whole watershed, and kind of understanding that landscape setting that Shayne was talking about. What's the slope? What's the valley position? Kind of what's going on in a really broad scale. Most of that work is done remotely. It's not actually done on the ground. We look at lots of mapping resources, topographic maps and all that kind of stuff. Better understand kind of the landscape view of the watershed. Move into phase 2, and that's where we actually get into the river. And there's this particular river was done in a few different sections. The first area was roughly, and this end of Dugway Road up to Moody Road in Hanksville. It was kind of the first stretch of river that was done with this phase 2 assessment, and that's literally walking in the river, every inch of that river, and doing a bunch of detailed measurements, collecting a whole bunch of data, taking cross sections throughout that whole run. Coming out of that phase 2 in 2005, we did a little bit of what's called corridor plan and project development, and that's kind of distilling all that data down into what does it mean, how does it reflect what's available, what we have available to either improve the situation or where is it already good. Came back in 2007, later in 2007, did the rest of the main stem, Winooski River, up to the gorge, through the gorge up to the Huntington end of Dugway Road, and then jumped up to Hanksville and did a few more reaches up there. And then we also did a few of the lower reaches of some of the major tributaries, the Texas Hill Brook, Fargo Brook, and Brushy Brook, all got looked at. 2009, we also we did the culvert inventory that Will was talking about. That was looking at each and every culvert through this section, bridge and culvert, taking very detailed measurements and evaluating their capacity to not only pass water, but to pass sediment and wood. And we also did some more detailed, what's called fluvial erosion hazard mapping, and that's developing a better understanding of the boundaries of the corridor within which you would expect the river to actually be migrating, doing those meanders, given relatively, what we'll say is relatively an unconfined situation. So we have a lot of lateral constraints in the corridor now, homes, bridges, roads, all these things that impact where we're going to allow the river to move and erode. And so that comes into play when we're looking at where the river is, how the river is going to react to that and erode in other places. And then finally, in 2009, we followed this all up, taking all of this data, redoing the corridor planning, coming up with a more comprehensive list of projects, and doing a little bit of kind of more final assessment that looked at the whole watershed, having done all of these different pieces of work. So I'm going to just talk about a few of the highlights. This is all, somewhat a long time ago at this point. I'm just going to talk about a few of the highlights of takeaways from some of that work, kind of how it relates to what these other guys have said. Buffer conditions, one of the pieces that we look at. Probably not surprising to many of you, the overall buffer conditions throughout the Huntington River aren't great. We had almost 40% of the assessed length, that's river length, with a forested buffer of less than 25 feet wide. So when Will was talking about those forested riparian buffers and the benefits that they bring to cooling the water and the habitat and all those various bucket of benefits.
Exactly. There's more.
We're a little bit hurting here. Bank erosion. 55% of the assessed length was found to have moderate or high erosion rating on at least one bank, and a good 20% on both banks. I think it's maybe interesting that the buffer conditions don't always correspond directly with the bank erosion. There's other things at play here when we're thinking about, I think there's an assumption that, oh, bad buffers always means bank erosion in that exact place, but that's not necessarily the case. Channel incision. And this is measured primarily with the cross-section work that we're doing, and what we've came up with here is some 88% of the assessed length is showing some moderate to severe evidence of historic channel incision. So that's that down-cutting bed, loss of access to the floodplain. Shayne talked about the channel evolution model and kind of where we are finding ourselves statewide in that 2, 3, and 4 stage between incising and stabilizing. And this is where at least back in the early 2000s, where the Huntington River shook out based on the data that was collected. Only about 6% of the length was actually actively incising, but a huge portion of it was actively widening. So it's kind of moved through from that incision stage into stage 3, and we're seeing it, the bed grading and the river moving laterally. No surprise, I think, right, for most of us who see this river. But 22% or so of the reaches are beginning that stabilizing process. I don't think they're probably very far down the road, but they're starting to move out of that widening phase, starting to stabilize a little bit, doing less lateral migration. When we lose that floodplain access, and we don't have the river's not able to get out and deposit its sediment and release the nutrients. All that is moving downstream in what we call a transport regime. And what we're seeing at least in this study, was that some 65% of the reaches are converted to transport regimes when they normally would be in an equilibrium stage. They would be, of course, kind of sediment in equals sediment out, right? But what we're seeing is a lot of that sediment's just moving right through. I won't spend a lot of time in this because Shayne kind of hit on the history pretty well. But I find this pretty interesting, just kind of from a local perspective, I guess, to kind of think about some of the catastrophic floods that we've experienced in this watershed. And I think we have a tendency to think about sort of what's happening right now, and don't really have the broad perspective all the time. And what occurs to me as I start to look at some of these dates is that we've actually experienced a fairly regular occurrence of what I'll call catastrophic floods in the Huntington River watershed. And there've been a lot of kind of major floods throughout Vermont that haven't really impacted the Huntington River watershed. But we had I'll just kind of look at the last 100 years here. We have the Great New England Hurricane, which was pretty devastating in the Huntington River watershed. In 1976, we had Hurricane Bell, and then this year we had another one. And we're looking at somewhere around a 40-year, pretty even time span for those. If anybody's interested, I have the Burlington Free Press from, I think it's August 11th, 1976. Hurricane Bell. There's a variety of pictures of the devastating flooding in Huntington, including Joe Spence rescuing some of his cows from the floodwaters, and I think there's some washed out bridges. 1976, I was 6 years old, living in Huntington Center, and every bridge except one into Huntington Center completely washed out. The Shaker Mountain Bridge was still standing. but very wobbly. And it had some benefits for a 6-year-old. It was the year I learned to ride a bike because there was no traffic on the road for quite a few weeks. But you know, talk about devastating floods. It was a lot.
Aaron, I think it's important to note that 2 people drowned.
Thank you. Yeah, we had 2 Huntington residents who died in that flood. There were 2 others elsewhere in the state who died as well, including 4 fatalities in that year. I thought I'd just talk really briefly about the water quality studies that we've done in the Huntington River. From about 2002 to 2018, the Huntington Conservation Commission started a project to study E. coli bacteria contamination in the Huntington River. We did that just here in Huntington for a couple of years, and then Richmond got very interested, and we sort of formed a little unofficial cooperative called the Huntington River Conservation Partnership. And we had teams of volunteers going out every week or every other week later, collecting water samples that would get taken to the state lab in Waterbury and then eventually to Randolph to test the E. coli bacteria levels at points all up and down the river. I know some of you here collected water samples. We made several attempts at trying to identify the source of the bacteria. The Huntington River was found to be, quite highly contaminated at certain times. In fact, the lower village was put on the state's impaired water list in, I think it was 2006 or 2007, for bacteria contamination. We weren't really successful ever at kind of nailing down a point source or one point source. We did some pretty cutting edge DNA analysis at one time to try to identify the actual type of mammal that the E. coli bacteria was coming from. And the results were interesting but somewhat unconclusive. Basically, they found that it seemed likely that it was a mixed source of humans, livestock, and wildlife. So the reason the lower village area was deemed impaired was because the levels were shown consistently high there. And so I think that's important to note. But we also found that we were able to link the high bacteria pretty well to high flow events, and more specifically to high flow events that followed periods of dry. So if you had an extended period of rain, you would tend to see the bacteria levels taper off. And then if you had a dry spell and then a big storm, you'd see those bacteria levels spike up. And so that suggests that there's a fair amount of probably surface water input coming off the land, flowing into the river, right? And also potentially a jump in the water table, a spike in the water table at a particular time that's pushing stuff out. And then the last thing I was just going to talk about a little bit was just some more personal, less scientific observations. Having put the canoe in the river this summer for the first time in a while, I always find this is a really good way to, well, first of all, to kind of reconnect with the Huntington River and to see it from a new perspective besides our roads and bridges again, but also just you really get this to see it in detail, and doing that repeatedly over many years, with many years in between, you start to see some of these differences. And so we put the canoe in the river in late August just for a 4-hour trip from the rec field down to Horseshoe Bend. And really wanted to get a look at things after the July flooding of this year, and just kind of get a better sense of what was going on out there. We certainly saw some bank erosion, but I wouldn't have said it was astronomically more bank erosion than we've had seen back in the early 2000s when we were doing geomorphic work, or in years prior when we had done canoe trips before that. There were some new large mass wasting sites. So a mass wasting site is one of these very, very tall hill slope banks that the river's banging into, so there were a couple of new sites that were notable, and considerably more dramatic than the bank erosion, in fact. We were able to see evidence of some of that historic bed incision, where you can actually, where some of that eroding bank is happening, you can see riverbank sediment at a higher elevation than the current bed. So real clear evidence that that river in that area has been down cutting and leaving the old bed sometimes 3 or 4 feet, sometimes even more higher. Saw considerably more Japanese knotweed than we have in the past. That's probably not a surprise to most of you, but it was, it shouldn't have been shocking, but it was, kind of having looked at it 15, 20 years ago, and to see it today, it's a big and unfortunate change. But on the plus side, what we noted was we're starting to see evidence of improved in-channel habitat. And really that took the form of, in this particular case, of seeing a lot more pools than we have in the past. When we did the work on that main stem in 2004 or 5, that same section from Horseshoe Bend to the rec field, working upstream, we documented a total of 4 pools. This summer, somewhere probably in the neighborhood of 10 or 12. Saw 15 or 18-inch brown trout. So I felt like, there is some hope here, looking at this river, and I think what we're seeing in those pools are some evidence that as we're starting to move out of that incision, through some of that widening and into that stabilizing phase of the channel evolution, we're starting to see some of those habitat characteristics take hold again. We're starting to see some of the banks starting to stabilize a little bit. We're starting to see maybe a little bit of places where the river can reconnect to some floodplains, or is forming some new floodplains that will serve that purpose in the future. So it's been a bad year for the river, but I don't think it's been all bad. And hopefully we'll have more good than bad as we move forward.
Thank you for ending on a positive note, Erin. So we're going to move into our question phase, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can. If folks have written questions down, Jeanette said she would come around and pick them up. I don't know if anyone wants to use the card, no obligation, that was just an option. And if folks want to come up and use the microphone, they're welcome. Otherwise, just speak loudly. And I know you all know this, but I'm just going to remind us all to be respectful and commit to communicating with courtesy, to listen attentively to others and have an open mind, and to encourage equal participation by being mindful of our speaking time and making space for others who may be less likely to speak up. So, who has a question or a comment? And you can also specify if this is for a particular panelist or for anyone to answer.
This is just a matter of definition. I know when give presentations, you can sometimes misspeak, so this may not matter that. In talking about the force of the river and the different aspects of what makes the force of the movement, the word slope was used, and in my mind, slope is a gravitational thing, going from up to down. But it seemed like it was being described as the meander of the river. So can you clarify what the term slope means when you're talking about the river?
Yeah, thanks. And sorry for being confusing. So yes, slope is from upstream to downstream. And the point there is that if you have a reach of river that starts somewhere, let's just arbitrarily say the elevation is 1,000 feet above sea level. And then that reach of river ends downstream at 980 feet above sea level. So it's dropped 20 feet, right? Now, if you draw a straight line down the valley from point A to point B, let's say that's a distance of 1 mile. So that river ran straight, it'd be a mile long, and it would drop 20 feet over that mile, so 20 feet per mile. But if that river's meandering back and forth across the valley, it's going to be longer than a mile, right? So if it's longer than a mile, then it's going to be 20 feet over 1.2 or 1.3 or 1. So it's flatter. That's the point, is that the meandering river has less slope than the straight river. Does that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Someone in the back has a question? Yeah, oh yeah.
Hi, my name is Annalise. I just want to thank all three panelists for coming and doing this amazing presentation. I think it's phenomenal, the work that you've put into helping us understand the natural course of waters, whether they're in a steeper valley or a wider valley, and how they go straighter or they meander more depending on what the valley itself says. And I think it's a lot of food for thought for people all over the world as the climate changes and the impacts vary and the floods come more and more often and heavier, to reevaluate what we think of as appropriate engagements with the river. I thought your points were brilliant, actually really, really spot on. And I did hear on, was it Brave Little State, that the reason that we have more Japanese knotweed all over the state right now is because of Hurricane Irene, that there was so much insane flooding and incision that the Japanese knotweed got spread all over the rivers, all over, and at first they thought, yeah, this can be a bank stabilizer, this might be good, but then they discovered that actually Japanese knotweed, the rhizomes run at the surface level of the dirt and they don't dig in deep to hold the dirt in place. So actually, because of the Japanese knotweed, instead of other riparian buffers, we're going to see more incision in the future. And yeah, I just thought it was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Is it going to be online somewhere where people can watch it?
It is being recorded right now, yes. Thank you, Lisa. Yes, Becky.
I too want to thank the panel for presenting some of this material. It was very, interesting learning about all the different aspects of what you presented tonight. As a lifelong Vermonter myself, having brook fished all my life, mostly when I was younger and could get around a little bit more easily. But one of the questions that I had for the panel is that one of the things that I think Vermont could look at is utilizing homeowners who own homes along the rivers and along the brooks as force multipliers in terms of helping to take care of the brooks and communicating effectively with those homeowners of the things that they could do on their own in order to support that river or brook or what have you. And I think a lot of times, when you have a situation such as a major flood and a homeowner loses a lot of their property or what have you, they're looking for quick answers, to kind of get an assessment. they're concerned, they're worried, you know. They may lose their home, they're losing property. And one of the things I was just thinking about as you folks were talking is you could do contact teams for major areas that have been hit and just put out there, say, hey, to the homeowners, look, we understand, you know, you've just got nailed by this particular flood. What can we do to help in terms of assessing the future needs of the brook or the river that you live along, and what areas you can go to in order to get help? And a lot of us, you know, we are concerned about, I want my grandchildren to have the opportunity to go brook fishing in Vermont. I mean, for crying out loud, I was in the Northeast Kingdom. I remember drinking out of the brook, you know, when we went fishing. So bottom line is that we've got to figure out a way to communicate more effectively in terms of homeowners or farmers or what have you on ways that we can do stuff. And just by doing a study, it's great to do a study, but what did you do with the study, you know? And how did that implement change in terms of what we did? And when you showed that particular river where it was just essentially flat, I was thinking to myself, well, how is that happening with not, you know, consultation and saying, okay, well, if you're going to do this, we at least need to put, you know, large rocks, whatever. But bottom line is, I'm looking for communication, helping to ease homeowners' minds that not only are you concerned about the aquatic life of a river, but you're also concerned about the human beings who are living in homes next to the river, because we're not the only ones who are being impacted. When you have buildings, and one of the things that, I don't know if it was addressed in your study, but one of the things that impact the river as well is when homeowners build homes on mountains and they clear swaths of land and allowing additional water to reach the tributaries and waterways. So that was just, you know, my comment. Again, thank you. Very interesting, you know, in terms of how the water works and channeling and what have you.
No, I think that's a really good point about the value of people who live in the community sort of being, I think, advocate, would that be the word I could use? Yeah, because I think you're right, like the state, the regulations, the funding, all of that, reality is we're not going to be able to buy our way or to regulate our way to whatever we want, you know, flood resiliency, water quality, habitat. It's going to require behavioral modifications. It's going to require people adopting the behaviors, the strategies on their own, volitionally, to do what I think we're going to need to do. And it's going to require, and that the way that that's going to happen is by neighbors talking to neighbors about, you know, flood response. What did you do during a flood? How did you respond to it? Or, you know, water quality issues or whatever. But I think the point that you brought up, I think, is spot on. You mentioned Streamwise earlier. There's actually, we're working with Friends of the Winooski River. They've come to Huntington. Streamwise basically is a program to basically develop that, to culture that, what you're talking about. Identify landowners who want to do the right thing, are doing the right thing. And sorry, that's a very loaded term. I'm sorry, I wish there was a better way I could have said that. But anyway, neighbors who are managing their property in a way that we think is consistent with natural river processes, flood resiliency, water quality, aquatic habitat, and providing them with tools basically to talk to their other neighbors, and provide them with information. So anyway, there is a program that we're working on to do that. Do you guys want to add anything?
Yeah, and I agree, and I'll just say that I believe that right now the Regional Planning Commission has begun a project to kind of pick back up the results of the corridor plan that we worked on back in 2008, 2009, and to take a new, fresh look at what types of projects would be most beneficial in today's environment. And I think one of those is, you know, part of that's going to be reaching out to to streamside landowners and working with people on developing some of these projects that could have some of those benefits. So fingers crossed that that happens in a good way.
I'll put in another plug for the Streamwise assessment. It is completely free to property owners. It's not so much response to flooding as more like come out and kind of give you ideas for how to just create a healthier stream environment. And so they do write up a report for you and give it to you, and list it out with recommendations of things you can do. And if you go to Friends of the Winooski website, you can link through there to put in formal requests to have a streamside assessment at your property. Okay, yes, question here.
Yeah, is there, I know that for farmers, there's federal and state funding to put in riparian buffer strips and convert ag land into riparian zones. Is there funding or support for landowners that might want to put in a buffer strip or support or reduce erosion by putting in trees, access to funding for folks that want to do that on their private property?
Streamwise does not actually pay for any of the recommendations that they make, but someone else may have an answer to that question. Do we know? I know the Huntington Conservation Commission is always looking for projects. We might be willing to help out, but that might not be the answer you're looking for.
I can try to answer that one. I'm Dan Albrecht, Regional Planning Commission. So the reference to projects on private land, state in recent years funding something called clean water service providers. This is a way to address phosphorus reduction projects, voluntary projects. So big picture, we have Lake Champlain phosphorus PMDL, low massive load. The state a couple of years ago said, EPA, we got this. We're going to improve regulations on farms, our wastewater plants. We're going to have municipal roads general permits, so that's why you see all this road work and ditching and turnouts and those kinds of things. So regulatory measures to reduce phosphorus, that gets you 80% of the way over the next 15, 20 years to hopefully meet the phosphorus reduction targets and report back to the EPA and say, see, we're cutting back the phosphorus in the lake. But 20% of the load, plus or minus, depending on what watershed you're in, needs to come from the voluntary sector. So the state is putting in about $7 million a year, passing it through the different regional planning commissions. The one for the Winooski drainage, which you guys are a part of, is actually managed by Central Vermont RPC. It's Brian Boyd and Lincoln Frasker, the two main staffers there. So they'd be the ones to contact about doing projects. The town could do a project. We're doing, as Mr. Worthley mentioned, we're working with the town right now on. We hired a consultant, Stone Environmental, to go back and look at the old 2009 study and find some phosphorus projects there. Because any kind of floodplain restoration, you get that whether you carve down the floodplain a little bit, back up a few feet so the water can get in, or you put fake beaver dams in the streams. Either way, you want to get that sediment to dump. You get the sediment to dump, boom, that's phosphorus. So these take some time. It's not like, and stream bank restoration projects, tree plantings have a phosphorus reduction benefit, calculators. So that's Regional Planning Commission work, like a vendor to Central Vermont RPC, so we can manage a project like we're doing now. So that's the best source for projects on private lands, reduce phosphorus runoff, or any private, potentially private road projects. That's a sort of a newer thing to look at, clear erosion and project, on that. If it's not just fixing the road, there's a clear sediment runoff into the stream. So that's the best short story for private roads.
Thank you.
I should do private property.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds like a good option for folks. Yes.
Well, I don't get out much, but I've noticed there was a petition from, I think, mostly homeowners who were affected by the July floods to the select board. And I'm not sure exactly what they were asking for. I think they were asking for permission to access the river and mine the gravel banks, and asking for subsidies from the town perhaps to do it, or asking the town to grants to make that happen. And I wonder how that relates to what you guys have talked about today. What the impact of that sort of, I don't know if I even understand what they were asking for, but I'd like to know more about it and how it relates to the...
Yeah, I don't know if anyone here can answer that question, what they're asking for, because I don't know that
Maybe there's
either.
someone here who signed the petition.
But we do have some panelists who are willing to speak to the broader issue.
So, yeah, I can't clarify exactly what the petition is. I mean, I think I generally understand it, and I think you articulated it fairly accurately, is to do river management work to reduce the flood hazards, is generally what they were asking. And whether or not the town would help pay for that, or the town's involvement would make funding easier to get from other sources, I'm a little unclear on that, but generally that was it. So, you know, it was back in 1986 that the laws around mining gravel changed. Before 1986, you could mine gravel and you could sell that gravel commercially for, I think it was $2 a ton, which I've been told in that time period was pretty good money for just digging gravel out of the river. It was somewhat profitable. There's probably some better minds on that than mine, but yeah, $2 a ton, just, I don't know, something like that. So after in 1986, the laws on that passed, the laws on that changed, and you could no longer mine gravel for profit. You could mine gravel if you were a riparian landowner, and you could use that gravel on your property to repair roads that you know, primarily with agricultural landowners in mind. You could use that gravel to repair roads, etc. I think the maximum of volume that you could remove is 10 or 50. Is that? 50. I've heard this number thrown around recently. Is it 50 cubic yards your annual? Yeah, so 50 cubic you can take per year. Prior to that, you know, gravel mining, it was done extensively. It was done without any understanding of what the implications were. It was done without any understanding of, you know, the fluvial geomorphology, the sciencey stuff that I talked about tonight wasn't really well understood. And it put us into this situation now where we have all these incised, unstable rivers. We still, however, remove gravel from rivers. I think between 2023 and 2024, that'd be August to August-ish. The state issued, I believe, 350 permits that included removal of gravel from the rivers. So we still remove gravel. Lots of times it's around public infrastructure, bridges, road embankments, et cetera, to mitigate the risk to that infrastructure. But we do it in a measured way, right? We understand the implications when we do it. We're careful. We survey these sites. We understand how much gravel to remove, and we do it. And it's a more, you know, well thought out, designed, scientifically informed way to do that. So all of that long-windedness is to say that in some locations, if we've done our homework and we use science and engineering to base designs on, we can remove gravel to reduce flooding hazards in a way that isn't going to cause negative impacts that outweigh the benefits of removing the gravel, right? You're always going to have some negative impacts, but you're mitigating another hazard, so you're balancing risks, right? And you're weighing those against each other, and your risks or hazards against each other. But we need to understand, you know, we need to do the studies to understand what the implications are. And it can't, what we've moved away from and what I'm proposing that the science is telling us we need to continue to move away from is the idea that you just go in and dig as deep as you can and get out as much as you can. Because that just gets us into trouble.
So you're talking the less disadvantageous method of gravel is bars above water line, I assume, correct? As opposed to just
trenching?
That is a practice that's become fairly commonly prescribed by the River Management Program, and I think
Can you repeat what Justin said?
yeah, so Justin asked if I'm suggesting that the activity of removing the gravel from the tops of gravel bars is a less impacting form of channel management than just dredging the entire channel. And it is a practice that has been commonly prescribed by the River Management Program. I think they do see that those gravel bars typically just rebuild when that gravel is removed. So they see it as a less impactful. I would say it's still impactful. We still need to understand it, but you know, the river management engineers, and really when you talk about people to go around and work with landowners and help them understand their risk and what they might do, the way that the whole system is set up, it's the river management engineers that are the ones that are really supposed to do that. They're the experts. So they're prescribing it. And what I think about, yeah, I'm not sure what I think about it in every case. I think all cases are different. There are some implications. And one of the things that whole balance situation, if you remove sediment from the Huntington, in Huntington, or if you remove sediment in Hanksville, and you dredge the rivers in Hanksville, and you said, the next storm comes along, that's less sediment getting down here that's available to get down here to sap the energy out of the water, also potentially cause conflicts, but sap energy out of the water, and it's more water you're sending down here because that water is not being stored on a floodplain up in Hanksville or up near Starksboro somewhere. That water's coming down here to the village, right? So when we remove gravel here, we're impacting folks downstream. So that's one thing I keep in mind about that whole thing. But yes, that is what they typically prescribe. Whether or not there's a huge benefit in terms of reduction of flood peaks, I think that's really questionable. Like, are you really, by scraping that little bit of gravel off of the bar, are you really reducing flood peaks all that much? I'm not sure if that's necessarily true.
Did anyone else want to speak?
Well, I'll just build on that a little bit. So we were actually looking, in preparation for this talk, we were looking at a study that was done in the 90s. I'm not sure. So this was a USGS study, I believe, done on 3 different rivers in Vermont in the early to mid 90s, looking at the modeling the impacts or the benefits to flood attenuation for dredging channels and also what's kind of colloquially called gravel bar scalping, which is this, removing the tops of these bars. And, I think I really agree with Shayne that I don't know that this, these things don't bear out the same way in every case, but what that study showed, the modeling showed that when you dredge a river, you do show immediate improvements to inundation. So, and that kind of goes along with the history that we've seen and what we see in that channel evolution model. But you also see very rapid, significant increases in erosion. And the model very, very clearly showed significant increases. And then with the gravel bar scalping, you didn't see that erosion impacts, but you also saw just negligible changes to the inundation situation. And I mean by negligible, I think the number was somewhere around 0.2 of a foot or something like that. So I think that's part of the one of the things that I think a lot about with this conversation about the gravel bar reduction is that it's not inexpensive to get contractors in there to do that. It's not without risk to you have to get there, you have to get down the bank and into the channel itself, so it's not without ecological risk. And is it after you've spent all that money and tried to mitigate that risk the best you can, are you actually getting any benefit out of it? And I think that's the important question in my mind that needs to be answered before we just jump to do something like that.
So if it's good for rivers, and I know it is, to have a floodplain to spread out and soak in, is it possible to create a floodplains for the Huntington if the Huntington doesn't have enough floodplains? I mean, it seems like it's creating its own, but is it possible to find a place that's good to have a floodplain?
Yeah, and I'll start with this one.
No, go for it.
Yeah. So that's the floodplain cut method, right? Where you have these high terraces that the river can't access until it gets some really high flow event, maybe above a 100-year flow event. So you go in and you excavate that down. You cut that down and you create lower lying land. And that is what, you're right, that is what the river is doing as it moves side to side. It's cutting into that high terrace, taking that away, and then as it meanders back the other way across the valley, it's building those point bars, and those point bars become the new floodplain. And they vegetate and provide all those, the function of the floodplain. So you can, that is a approach that's used. I've been involved in 3 or 4 of those projects and throughout the state, and that's an approach. Very expensive.
Shayne, another approach which you also are pioneering is actually bringing the channel up to the floodplain. So not just bringing the floodplain down, but so like the wood addition that I was talking about, where it's safe to do so, we're finding that actually is helping to reconnect the floodplain. And so there's plenty of other examples I could have shown of where we have state land, state forests, where it's all flooded in the floodplain because we've done these wood addition projects. Shayne's also doing a lot of work in other areas, actually recreating wetlands and things like that, up in higher smaller order streams. It's smaller scale. It's not maybe as a massive floodplain, but the idea being that if we can store water in these smaller spaces, if we can get enough of that, it can help it slow down some of that flood water. I think something else to emphasize, so that we can mitigate some of this. We can do some like slowing the water, storing it. But again, with the size of the floods we're seeing, it's going to overwhelm it at some point. I think the floods that we've seen this year, I think unfortunately what we've seen is, when we've built in harm's way, that those areas are going to be inundated or there's going to be erosion. And so that's the other side of this. Is yes, it's important to do that, but recognize that there's a limit to what we can achieve through that approach in terms of the flood, lowering our flood elevations.
Margaret?
So my question is, I'm just thinking about, we have so many private landowners along the Huntington River, and what it sounds to me is like we really need a holistic approach to this river, because what someone does upstream is going to affect someone downstream, and if we reconnect the floodplain downstream, it's not going to help the people upstream. Do you guys have any examples of where we've been able to think about it in that way and have it work successfully? Just knowing how much private land we have in the state and how everyone's kind of doing their own thing, but not necessarily able to work together.
Yeah, Otter Creek.
But Otter Creek, isn't a lot of that public land?
Or is it the Lewis Creek? It's like over in Heinsberg. Lewis Creek.
Lewis Creek.
Lewis Creek. They worked with dozens and dozens of landowners. There's a great video somewhere online of what it looked like after the latest flood. It was that inundation thing where the trees were standing and the water was spread out everywhere, but it wasn't death and destruction to all the stream beds and the roads and the valleys and the farmland. Lewis Creek Association is a good place to go look.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it's a local advocate who's able to has the connections, has the knowledge, and able to bring that together. Yeah, do you want to?
Well, I'll just say, I mean, obviously, if a property becomes a FEMA buyout, that's a really, really hard thing for a landowner to go through. But once it becomes town-owned property, that property is able to become floodplain. And so those places are opportunities to kind of reconnect the land to the river. Again, FEMA buyout is a challenging place to be, but once that process does happen, if it does go through, it gives us an opportunity to restore the floodplain in those places. Over here, I don't think you've had a question yet.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that Aaron's work on the corridor plan is kind of a holistic approach.
Yeah.
And it generates a lot of projects and looks at the stream, the river holistically, and where our areas can strategically do something that will benefit the common good for a lot of people. But it does take a lot of partnerships and a lot of private landowner buy-in. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of money. But it is a holistic approach at looking at the entire waterway.
Well, yes, I agree. I think it's also really relevant and important to keep in mind that in this watershed we have a lot of what I mentioned, lateral constraints, and so these are the things that really prohibit us from allowing our river to move in areas where it would otherwise naturally be inclined to do so. And we are all, as a society, making commitments to protect those things, and to the best of our ability to improve them, to make them more resilient and better able to handle the forces of the river. But they still exist, and they still require us to be, managing in and around them. And so when I actually did make a map, and in the interest of time, I didn't end up sticking this particular one into the slide deck today, but just overlaying kind of our lateral constraints with what's left in the river corridor, and you start to narrow down kind of where you can really focus your efforts in thinking about floodplain mitigation and these kinds of things. So I think there is a filtering method available to us too, that we fully understand that we will be protecting homes and infrastructure in many places, in many cases, and looking at ways to be more resilient and move out of the way when we can, but we're not going to get completely out of the way. And we crisscross this river all up and down the valley, and it's a relatively confined setting, and so there's no turning away from that if we're all going to continue to be here. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just got here a few minutes ago. I wanted to be here earlier, but I couldn't be. I own about maybe a third or a half a mile of river, both sides. I've got a section of river 20 feet high, 150 yards long, 60 yards away from the old bank. That's all topsoil, and it went away. And I watched this. There's no way that my land is floodplain. The river is just eating into my fields. It's moving away from the river, where it used to be 150 yards in 15 years. 150, 200 yards to the east. And it's chewing up riverbank. And I watch this every year, and not a single person has come and said, can we walk on your land? Can we look at your river? Can we study this? How many cubic yards, how many thousands of cubic yards of topsoil have washed into the river? So my point is, if the river gets shallow, somewhere's down below, what's the water, what's it doing? I mean, I invite you to come to my place. I'll walk you down there, I'll show it to you. Take a look at it. It's absolutely horrendous. I just about cry every time you look at it, and not a single person has come and asked me about it. You want to come and look at it? Give me a call.
Where do you live?
It's in Hanksville. It's below like Kingsfield, between Joe King and
Tomlinson's, it's a half a mile of river, and I lose trees, I lose riverbank, I lose everything every year, and nobody's called me up and said, hey, can you come look at it? It's horrible. And we talk about the natural flow of the river. How many tons of phosphorus are in that topsoil? Where does it go? It ends up in the lake. I mean, phosphorus is sequestered in topsoil, right? So how much of that ends up in the lake? Probably all of it. How many feet of river bottom how much has the river risen below it, downstream from me? You're invited to come and see and say, this is our suggestion. Let's just let it go until it reaches the road, and then we'll put some steel beams in and save it. Meanwhile, it's just desert. There's nothing growing there.
Yeah, so that's that incised channel condition, right? Really high banks.
Super high banks.
Super high banks, yeah.
And they go away, I mean, it's half the height of this room.
Yeah, and
what am I
the
supposed
roads,
to do? I can't do a thing to it, right?
right, the road's pretty close on the other side.
No, it's hundreds of yards away.
Okay, the road's
So we got many years before it reaches the road, but what are we doing in the meantime?
Yeah, tall banks on both sides.
I got mountain on one side, it doesn't go that
Right
way.
up against the valley wall.
Long straight section.
And
Okay.
the other side of the river, just down below my neighbor's land, I've got trees stacked up 8 feet high, laid horizontal against the bank, and the river's just marching away from that side of the river.
Yeah, so, this is this incised channel condition. Banks are really high, the channel fills during a flood, the water's 6, 7 feet deep during a flood event.
So when you
During a flood event?
see the water coming through there, what does it do?
Well, during the flood event, how deep does that water get? I mean, that's,
What, 8, 10 feet?
yeah, 8, 10 feet, right? So that's like, that's 62 pounds on top of 62 pounds, and 620 pounds, and so you get a lot of shear stress. So it's that really unstable condition. The idea of, I thought I knew where you were talking about, but I don't think I have it pictured correctly, but restoration ideas range from cutting down that high bank to give it that floodplain, that pressure relief valve. You can scrape the topsoil and put it somewhere else and cut down the floodplain, give it that pressure relief valve. We can't really put wood in the main stem of the Huntington, but if you could, that slows the water down. That trapped sediments coming from upstream, it builds the bed back up so you can regain that connectivity. Maybe there are other ideas for, when you talk about river restoration, it ranges from really true river restoration towards property protection. So there may be more property protection sort of things we could do, but that it all stems from this incised channel condition, because it's exactly what we're talking about. Right, but I'd be happy to come and take a look. Okay, yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to do that actually. So thanks for the invitation. All right, Justin, did your hand go up?
Let's just get into the weeds about it. Is it like the soil geomorphology in the field he's talking about is not a standard floodplain.
Yeah,
you should go look at it. It's a very interesting piece of land that's not channel incision from what I can tell. It's
cutting a new channel.
Hundreds of millions of yards of sand being deposited 15,000 years ago. When the valley was flowing the other way. It's complicated.
That's the other thing we have going on in those valleys is really interesting surficial geology because of our proximity to the lake and what happened when the lake rose and we were lake shore or beach, and we have all these cane terraces all over the place and these sand deposits everywhere, Texas Hill, and it creates really dynamic. So that adds a whole layer, and Justin, I know you're really familiar with that. I'd love to come out and look and talk and learn more and see if there's anything we could do.
There's half a dozen places like that along the river.
It looks like we've got one more question in the back here, and then we are at time. So I think this will probably be our last question for the night, and I'll just make a quick announcement, and then we'll be done. So please go ahead. That's you.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
I don't want to on a nice note. I know it mine possibly isn't. Just that, we're talking about increases in temperature and everything, and we know that as the atmosphere atmosphere warms, it's holding more moisture, and we're talking about equilibrium and stream restoration. I restore buildings, but I restore them to a time period, and I don't know how we can restore rivers back to a time period that existed 100 years ago when we didn't have the climate that we now have. And so there's not a solution here, and I appreciate you guys being here, but I think there's a big giant elephant in the room that's like, it's gonna be ridiculously humid this summer, and it's gonna rain like crazy. We know it's going to, and we don't know how bad it's gonna be. We know that there's culverts that we put back this year that shouldn't have been put back. So yeah, I think at some point, like, this is a great discussion, but I think at some point we actually need to talk about like where we put these blowouts, like where we're gonna actually say, all right, we're gonna give up this chunk of land so that these houses can survive, these bridges can survive, because there's like, it's not gonna just get better. I hate to say it. That's why I don't want to end. I don't want to go to end. But it's not like nothing's getting better on this. So. Sorry.
Well, great comment. Like, really appreciate that.
I'll just say, I think actually in some ways that it is a good place to end because it's about thinking holistically, and that's, I think, what we need to do especially in this community. So it's an opportunity for us to try to bring all the pieces together and think about how do we think about climate change and the river and the community and the people whose homes are impacted. That's why this is such a complex issue, is because there are so many factors. It's not easy. So, and climate change is a factor, and there's so much we don't know about what's going to happen in the future, but working together as a community is the best we can do, I think, to do the best we can to protect people's homes when possible and take care of each other when flooding happens. And so there are some, I think, positive things about this bringing us together. So I just want to say thank you. That was a lot of information we got tonight, a huge amount of information. Thank you guys so much. I'm sure we're all going to take time to absorb all of that, and this will be, this is being recorded and will be available, and we'll let folks know once it's posted. And thanks to all the volunteers who helped with setup and everything else, and thank you all for engaging with the issues and being here with us tonight. So thanks for coming. And thanks again, you guys. Great job.